So, ladies and gentlemen, my own name is Ronan Gingles. I'm Chair of Engineers Ireland Cork Region, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture on the EU Green Deal. This evening's speaker is Ronan Gingles, who is the European Affairs Coordinator at Cork City Council, and he has overall responsibility for bringing about and supporting quality engagement in EU cooperation projects and networks. This dynamic portfolio of activity stretches throughout the organisation and is enabling Cork to collaborate with like-minded cities and organisations across the continent on addressing specific common challenges, comparing perspectives, exchanging knowledge and drawing inspiration and practical lessons to inform its future development. From 2008 to 2018, Ronan was based in Brussels, where he guided the Irish local and regional government sector's interaction with European affairs and funding. Prior to that, he worked extensively in the management of Interreg funding programmes. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ronan.
Thank you, Ronan, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening. A little word from our sponsors, if you will, before I begin about ourselves. The EU is known for its liking for acronyms and for logos, and this is our array of activity in Cork City Council in that regard, ongoing and very recent. And my job is really to be a focal point for all of this activity, matters European, to identify and size up prospects, to make those external connections, to foster internal interest in this building with the right people, to join up approaches and to advise and interpret and make sense of the jargon. So it's all about really informing and facilitating Cork's access to and maximising the quality of its engagement in European affairs, both funding and otherwise, in a whole of organisation sense, trying to contribute to the realisation of our objectives as an organisation and Cork's development as a world-class city over the coming years. And part of that is keeping things on track as well as looking for new opportunities. So we have 33 activities at the moment, some of them programmed investments, some of them transnational projects with other parts of the world, just seeking to broaden the horizons of the city, sharing experience and knowledge, accessing best practice, alternative approaches, demonstrating how different approaches can be adapted and transferred to our circumstance, and trying to make a mark on Europe. And we use funding as an enabler in that regard, but it's not the be all and end all. Some of them have an engineering focus. I'm thinking of our work on the port redevelopment, where we did a relocation study to inform its relocation to Ringaskiddy. Work on brownfield redesign in the Cork Docklands. You'll be familiar with the context there. We've also done projects on resilience, planning for extreme weather events, on smart cities at the nexus of energy, transport and digital, on heritage renovation, and quite a lot of work on social housing, energy retrofits. In that regard, I'm here at the prompting of Brian Cassidy, my colleague in housing maintenance. And given that he's asked me to present and nod in his direction on a couple of our projects, which are among our greener endeavours. Red Wolf is looking about electricity distribution, where we're providing 10 pilot sites in social housing, which doesn't have a central heating provision, for a project to demonstrate the energy and carbon saving potential of combining these three components together. And partners include Sligo Institute of Technology. Another project under Horizon 2020 is called Mini Store, which aims to create a suitable solution to enhance the energy efficiency potential of building stock by developing small-sized devices, what's called a novel compact integrated thermal storage system, and demonstrating the value of that in delivering sustainable heating, cooling and electricity storage in residential households. That's being led by IERC in Tyndall, in UCC. And we have other smaller projects. Build Upon 2 looks at low carbon retrofitting to empower cities to engage with national governments and with industry bodies like the Irish Green Building Council to decarbonise building stock. And we also advise on a project called Indu Zero, which is looking at designing a blueprint for smart factory to reduce the cost of retrofitting. And then we have more bigger scale infrastructural projects in this realm, such as Mary Elm's Bridge, which is a piece of infrastructure, but is badged as green because of how it's integrated into the city's mobility strategy. Beg your pardon. Sorry, the lights have also gone out here because I haven't moved. And Marina Park, which is part of the redevelopment of the Docklands. But on with the show, a disclaimer, firstly, I'm not an environmental specialist, climate scientist, nor an engineer. I'm coming at this with no particular agenda, despite my time spent in Brussels beyond trying to provide a bit of information in the dark. And I'm going to attempt to give a balanced analysis of the EU Green Deal, different resources, different competing perspectives, perhaps, but ultimately it's just going to be a personal reading on the topic. It's a very, very big issue, as big as an elephant now, I think of it, but that's not the purpose of this image. It's a huge issue, it's a huge series of issues. It's got many moving parts, many actors involved, and it's hard to tell where one part begins and ends. So it's hard to distinguish really from proposal to the modification as part of the legislative sausage factory process mix that comes into play in Brussels. This is especially true of the financial aspects, which seem to change from one month to the next. And it's interesting that many of the websites associated with the Green Deal have stood still since the proposal was brought about in the spring. So caution to all the information I'm providing in that regard. What I'm going to try is to unpack what's quite conceptual and make it reasonably relatable and practical. So I'm going to look at the context of the Green Deal, its motivations, its themes, its actions, and some of the issues and challenges, concluding with the financial side of things, and if we have time, what it might mean to Ireland. Maybe that's a discussion we'll get into afterwards. I'm going to try and avoid going down too many cul-de-sacs in explaining the technicalities and the jargon, which are sadly unavoidable with EU affairs. What I'm going to give is a helicopter view, and you can look into the references yourself. Hopefully the slides will let you do that. And I'll take questions afterwards, but given that I'm a jack of all trades and master of none, I can't guarantee that I'm going to answer any of them properly. Now, this is an image I use in relation to trying to develop EU projects within this organization. It's trying to look at things in the round in an integrated sense, because very often people look at things from a very limited lens, if you will. And the Green Deal is all things to all men, to be frank. It's an agenda for sustainable, but quote unquote, air marks around any of this. Some of the descriptions I found for it of late: an agenda for sustainable growth, a pathway to a climate neutral Europe, a radical shift to make the EU climate neutral across every aspect of society and the economy, a constitutional shift in what the EU is about, the largest investment in the history of Europe since the Second World War, since the Marshall Plan, the motor and compass of our recovery, the flagship policy framework for the current European Commission, a guiding consideration for most of EU expenditure for the coming years, a major transformation and modernization of key elements of the economy, a means to make the EU's economic recovery, or recovery on top of the original recovery maybe, sustainable and inclusive, and so on. It's a paradigm shift. It's a blueprint for a green transition, if that's not a coloring contradiction in terms. It's a roadmap of far-reaching reforms. It's a revolution into cleaner and greener technology. It's a climate law, and so on, so on. So it's a bit like Winston Churchill's comment on Russia. It's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But it's also something that's quite skeletal. I'm not saying it's extinct here by any stretch. It's only been on the go for exactly a year, but it's just 24 pages of text, which is nothing really in European terms. It's a package of policy measures. It's several support strategies which are policy themed, but it's very much a work in progress. So you'll have to bear that in mind. It's something that needs fleshing out and has a certain amount of that done in the 12 months since it was released into the public realm last December. Its goals, its end goal is clear enough, but the substance is still being negotiated, and there are many moving parts and many actors. So it's a little bit like trying to pick up mercury with a fork, to be frank with you. It's a bit like the old story about Richard Nixon asking the Chinese Prime Minister what he thought about the French Revolution back in 1972, to which he was told it's too early to say. So take it in that spirit and we should be okay for the next half hour or so. Perhaps the best quote would go straight to source from the communication back in this time last year. It's a new growth strategy that aims to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource efficient and competitive economy where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gas in 2050 and where economic growth is decoupled from resource use. That's the big picture and that's reasonably coherent. It's also very complex, very ambitious. You're talking about deeply transformative policies tackling the root causes. And this is coming at a time of real complexity and change for the world. Huge climate and biodiversity crisis, yes, but also dynamic geopolitics, changes in demographics and the economy. We're on the cusp of massive digital disruption with Industrial Revolution 4.0. And that was even before 2020 came into play and all that's brought us, mainly for bad rather than good. So we have to work backwards from there 2050 and piece it all together. So let's think about some of the motives and the objectives that have brought this about. I class these into four broad categories. We'll start with the policy angle, which is putting environmental concerns center stage, along with circularity and resource efficiency and climate action at the heart of EU policy making, and a realization that it's coming center stage in reality as droughts rage and, you know, this time last year fires were burning in Australia, the ice caps had been melting, and we're all, in Cork in particular, we're familiar enough with storm events. But beyond that, there's the evidence of all of this, that this has come into play. Science is now increasingly unquestioned and is projecting ahead. The impacts are felt throughout Europe, and we know it's likely to increase in intensity and frequency. And without drastic abatement measures, particularly in emission terms, it's only likely to get worse with massive impacts on the planet, on ecosystems, on food security, on people. So Europe has, for the last 30 years, been making steady progress in environmental terms, but it's slowing down in areas such as reducing carbon emissions, industrially and domestically. It's slowing down also in terms of curbing our generation of waste and even energy efficiency, and the share of renewables has started to, within the overall mix, has started to slow to a good deal. So the degradation is taking hold. We need to fundamentally, at this stage, transform what we're doing in order to allow the planet to breathe and prosper. And this needs to be speeded up massively in relation to energy, food, mobility, etc., etc. Beyond that, there's the moral, I suppose, compass that we need to think about. The need to protect people, the planet, and prosperity, safeguarding citizens, as well as shielding our economic investments and assets. And there's a realization that Europe in particular has played a massive role in the stock of carbon that's gone into the atmosphere in the last 300 years. And that has warmed the planet, and only half of that has been contained by the planet as a sink. With that comes a responsibility to the rest of the world, particularly to the developing world, and a need to show global leadership in this play, set standards for sustainable growth, and to correspond with the Paris Agreement. And I'll come back to various other global imperatives that come into play shortly. And then for the economy, there's a realization that it's not a zero-sum game, that those 3 decades of some progress have corresponded with a 61% jump in EU GDP. So the two aren't mutually exclusive, they're compatible and they're beneficial agendas. So protecting our environment delivers not just public goods, but also economic growth. And so that's the cornerstone really of the thinking behind the Green Deal, that there's an ability to create job opportunities, and to promote growth with more efficient and sane use of resource and a cleaner circular economy. So in a sense, it's a need for an economic reset, and it's an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, accepting that that might be something of a, in somewhat bad taste in terms of biodiversity. The final imperative is the functional one. It's a realization that today's greenhouse gases in Europe come from a set number of core contributory sectors: power production, transportation, but also industry, commerce, and residential fuel combustion, agriculture, including the burning of biomass. These all have to flatline within the next 3 decades. And here we see just the quantification of where this stands. You'd see that energy and transport and industry are far and away the dominant players, but then buildings, biomass, and agriculture come not too far beyond them. And they really do overplay the emphasis that's often placed on, say, aviation in particular, or waste emissions. And all we have in order to abate that are land use and forestry, which make a fairly marginal contribution, all things considered. So Europe has assumed the burden of leading from the front, but as Sam Bennett well knows from the Tour de France, even when you're in the green jersey, it's a marathon, not a sprint. He only got his moments of glory towards the end of the day and ultimately on the podium in Paris. Going global, if you will, is something that allows an increasingly internationalized EU to play a global role as a global power, particularly in trying to influence other G20 economies, those who are responsible for 3/4 of the global greenhouse emissions, to make net zero contributions themselves. And this has already been successful. Japan is going to mimic precisely what the EU has done in terms of a 2050 target. China, crucially, will do likewise for 2060. And now with the new Biden administration in Washington, whose emissions are twice that of the EU, there is great hope for the future that the US will swiftly rejoin the Paris Agreement on day one in late January 2020. But it's about pressing other countries to square up to Europe, which is a relatively small player in the great scheme of things, about 8% of emissions. But we are the only major economy or bloc to put this kind of legislation in place, covering all sectors at this moment. So Europe can also use some of its position at the center of global travel and trade to set standards in aviation and shipping, and a ripple effect beyond its border. And also use its emissions trading system, the reform and review of that, to try and bring more influence. Frankly, Europe is also a bit worried about being left behind in the great green technological shift that's being brought about, as happened with solar power, as is happening increasingly perhaps with wind, and also with electronic vehicles. So there's a need to be seen to invest in cutting edge research and technology in order just to try and nail that down from the outset. But there are challenges, and I'm going to try and deal with the challenges in each of these cases as best I can. Not just the small footprint of the EU in that sense, but also the fact that there's no guarantee that the developing world, Africa in particular, India to an extent, won't be on board with this. And that Europe will have to try and influence decision makers in those parts of the world through its overseas aid and investment budget to try and tally along, because there's a serious risk that other countries won't follow suit. And that in turn will have a big bloody blow to European competitiveness in terms of exports from European countries. So in that regard, Europe will try to flex a few muscles, if you will, to try and coax its trading partners into cooperating. What's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is essentially a tax to ensure that imports into Europe will take a more sustainable approach to their manufacture and production, and a pledge to only sign trade accords with partners who are willing to sign up to binding green goals. That comes with the caveat, of course, that trade agreements like Mercosur are particularly, let's say, controversial, I might say iffy in terms of squaring trade agenda with that of sustainability, and that's something that needs to be brought into play, brought into people's thinking. But this isn't about the EU delivering a fait accompli. Fundamentally, what the Commission does is facilitate the choices that its member states want to make. So there's a need for a cohesive approach among the now 27 governments, a need for synergies between national approaches, national programs, and a need to recognize that as the EU moves in a certain direction, certain member states and certain regions aren't all starting at the same point. They have longer ways to go each to reach the climate end goals. Some are more affected by transition than others, some are more dependent on fossil fuels than others, and some are therefore more reticent. And we have a situation now where Germany won't phase out coal mines, for example, till 2038, but it isn't the most coal intensive member state by any stretch otherwise. So this is occupying thinking in capitals in particular from Warsaw to Prague to Sofia, the need to start addressing how nation states handle their emissions in relation to their steel plants, their truck fleets, their building stock. For Europe, it's not just about new measures either, it's about the need to step up enforcement on existing environmental legislation, possibly infringement procedures where member states don't fall into play, ultimately financial penalties if it comes to that. And Ireland has a number of those on the burner, unfortunately, with the Water Framework Directive and others likely to come before the Court of Justice soon. So the Commission is stepping up the carrot that goes with the stick in terms of providing financial, technical and policy support to member states to help them identify and fill the implementation gaps in key areas like pollution, circularity, biodiversity and environmental governance. We also need to bear in mind that there are different environmental priorities in different parts of Europe. In some places it's water quality, in some it's air quality, in some it's circularity. So one of the reasons I declined this invitation for November originally was that we were waiting for the European Council to meet in December to, in effect, agree where the Green Deal had gone. They gave Brexit about 10 minutes. Given that Mr. Johnson had been told to negotiate directly with Mr. Barnier. But in terms of where the heads of state and government were going with this, there was a need to copper fasten their agreement on the deal proposal from the Commission 1 year in. So they celebrated this with a reasonably coherent approach by endorsing the agreement. And I'll just quote you some of the text. The target, which is climate neutrality by 2050, will be delivered collectively by the EU. And that was crucial because there was some reticence among certain member states like Poland and Hungary. In the most cost-effective manner possible, all member states will participate in the effort, taking into account considerations of fairness and solidarity while leaving no one behind. There will be a new 2030 target to be achieved in a way that preserves the EU's competitiveness and takes advantage of member states' differing start points and specific national circumstances and emission reduction potential. So these conclusions, as they're called, are hot off the press, and I'll try and bring them into play as we deal with each of the topics as we go through the EGD. And I should say also the Parliament is the other key player in proceedings. This is the roadmap, if you will. Again, it's from the original document in December. You can have this for reference in terms of outlining the action plan, the various strategies which have been pushed out despite COVID over the course of 2020 by the Commission. Pretty prolific, really, all things considered. And on these two slides, you'll see them, some of them to come next year, so you'll have that for reference. Moving on to the meat of the matter, there are 8 policy areas within the Green Deal, usually presented as this in this format, tend to work in an anti-clockwise format. And there's a lot of inconsistency about the titling, the badging, and the names that are put on each of these. But I'm going to look at them each in turn to just give you a little bit of sense of where they're coming from. they have been, as I say, front-loaded to a certain extent during 2020 and 2021. The daddy of them all has to be climate ambition and enhanced climate action to make the EU climate neutral within the next 30 years. At the core of this is what's called a climate law. That's the centerpiece, an agreement that will enshrine political commitment towards this within legislation, plus the measures to achieve it. Bear in mind, this is a net target, which will rely heavily on carbon sinks from land use and forestry, so a little bit less decarbonisation than some might have in mind. Nonetheless, it is very laudable and ambitious. And the climate law sets the target for the direction, a target for all EU policy, and establishes a long-term framework in that regard, plus the governance arrangements for delivery, monitoring and review, as well as mitigation efforts and foreseeing regular assessment on climate adaptation measures by the European bodies. What makes it unique is that it is legally binding, and when it's adopted, which should be without too much undue delay now, member states and the EU will be required by law to comply and take the necessary measures to achieve it. Crucially, it includes confirmation of the interim target for 2030, now just 9 and something years away, of a 55% reduction in the baseline for emissions. That's set on a 1990 baseline. The target until now had been minus 40%. So that was agreed back in 2014, just in advance of the Paris Agreement negotiations. So this solidifies that ambition. Seemingly, according to the Commission, we're on course at this moment for 45% improvement. So this goes the extra mile over and above where we wanted to be. But some of the Nordic countries in particular wanted 60%, as did the European Parliament's Environmental Committee. So this, as I say, was endorsed within the recent conclusions as a binding target for a net domestic reduction of at least 55%. And Poland has been brought on board in that regard, all the reports are. Though it's not always easy to read that into the news reports. But additional measures are urgently needed, and this is being impressed upon the member states. Now the Commission's job is to take all its climate and energy and related environmental legislation, all that massive dossier, and make it fit for 55 in time for next summer. Okay. Now, beyond that, what do I need to draw on with that? Yeah, I should just say that one of the other achievements of the year was the October saw a methane emissions strategy introduced to reduce levels of this key contributor within specifically energy, agriculture and the waste sectors. And 2021 will see a new, more ambitious adaptation strategy on climate change, which will look in particular at the economic effects of the current health crisis and why we're going to need to build back better. So seeing the recovery as an opportunity, the COVID recovery, as an opportunity to increase the resilience of society right across the board. And in climate ambition, there are a number of key sectoral challenges. One of them is going to be the pivotal role of cities in driving climate action and related innovations, social innovations and governance innovation. And another is going to be how Europe's regions can assist communities and economies to adapt to climate change. Number two is the energy sector. Decarbonising this is going to be a massive challenge. The sector accounts for 75% of all our emissions. So the Green Deal will try to help create a fully integrated, interconnected, digitised EU energy market to provide a secure, affordable supply for all, promoting and integrating renewables into the mix and providing for their smart integration using grids. And storage solutions, for example, with batteries and corresponding networks and sector integration approaches. So it needs to take place at the lowest possible cost, ensuring circularity while tackling energy poverty at the domestic level. It's critical that households will be able to afford key energy services, for want of a better phrase. So we've seen a strategy for energy integration to pave the way to full decarbonisation, greater efficiency and interconnected energy sector that came in July. That was accompanied by a hydrogen strategy and just last month the offshore renewables strategy to increase capacity 25-fold to something like 60 gigawatts by 2030 and 300 gigawatts ultimately by 2050. And this will be based on this. There's vast potential, obviously, that stands to reason within Europe to seize global leadership in this regard on behalf of its company. So that'll create opportunities in itself for industries to create green jobs right across the continent and strengthen Europe's hold on the offshore energy sector. The third area is industry, sustainable industry, as it's sometimes called, mobilizing more environmentally respectful production cycles, supporting industry to innovate. Circularity is more emphasized in some versions that you see to summarize the Green Deal than others, but more broadly looks at in particular an energy intensive industry, particularly steel, chemicals, cement, the backbone of Europe's economy in many senses, and how to address their critical value and supply chains. Industries like this account for 20% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. So really their decarbonisation is a massive priority. And at the same time, autonomy in these sectors along the value chains needs to be secured and guaranteed. So switching to alternative climate neutral energy and raw material and input sources is going to be crucial there. March saw the adoption of the European Industrial Strategy to plan for a future ready economy to help industries, including SMEs, lead the way in sustainable and digital technology. Digital is going to be a key aspect of this approach, looking at more circular product designs, given that so little of materials used in industry comes from recycling, something like 12%, which was quite a striking fact for me. One of the highest profile outputs of EGD through the moment has been the Circular Economy Action Plan, looking at sustainable resources. It includes a sustainable products initiative for more durable, reusable, repairable, recyclable and energy efficient products, as well as measures to really make sustainability in products the norm, with a focus in particular on the highest emitting areas where resource use and depletion is at its most: ICT and electricity, batteries, vehicles, packaging, plastic, textiles, construction and buildings, food, waste and nutrients. All about ensuring less waste, but also empowering consumers through information and empowering public buyers through procurement, just to make circularity work. So again, seizing the lead in international terms. There will soon be measures also to introduce to try to ensure that all packaging in the EU is reusable and recyclable by 2030, which is going to be a particular challenge for a food producing country such as Ireland. And there are major challenges for industry and energy. I might come back to those if you don't mind, if there are any questions at the end, because I'm conscious just of time and getting bogged down. Number 4 is building and renovating, the need for cleaner construction sector, to be more energy efficient, to be more resource efficient. Buildings are responsible for 40% of our energy consumption in Europe and 36% of our greenhouse gas emissions. But annually, only less than 1% or thereabouts of building stock undergoes retrofit or renovation. So like an extreme storm, it's a once a century event, and that's not good enough. And there are also quite a lot of mineral resource demands that go into building. So October saw the publication of the Renovation Wave strategy, which aims to double those renovation rates over the next 10 years and ramp them up further beyond 2030. Could see 35 million buildings renovated by 2030. That in itself is estimated to create 160,000 jobs in the construction sector. But we only have 30 years in which to develop an entirely clean building stock. So this will impress the gravity of the situation upon us all. Allied to that, there's also the need to avoid energy poverty and help consumers keep their homes warm, particular attention to social housing and to assisting households that are struggling with energy bills. But also public buildings, schools and hospitals need to be addressed, and they are given a certain amount of priority. Thinking there obviously being that heating them will cost less, therefore there will be more public money to go towards education in schools and public health in hospitals. Number 5 is mobility. Transport gives us a quarter of our emissions. The Green Deal is looking for a 90% reduction in this sector by 2050. And all modes need to contribute to the goal, with an emphasis on boosting multimodality, promoting and supporting sustainable and smart initiatives, and accelerating the shift, as they've put it. So this will be the rollout of cleaner, cheaper and healthier forms of both public and private transport. There'll be supports for automated mobility and smart traffic management systems. There will be a slashing of transport emissions in ports and airports, ramping up the production and deployment of sustainable alternative fuels, elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, and measures to incentivize transport of freight by rail and water. And I haven't even mentioned the rollout of electric vehicles. There'll be support directly there in that regard. The 6th of 8th is the food system, sometimes called From Farm to Fork, which is a strategy, sometimes called the greening of the CAP. It's all about paving the way for more sustainable food systems, lessening air, water and soil pollution through pesticides and fertilizer, lessening the excessive consumption of natural resources, the erosion of biodiversity and the impact on climate change. Farm to Fork came out in May as a strategy and aims to make food systems, including consumption patterns and waste, fairer, healthier, more environmentally friendly, both for farmers and consumers. It's a comprehensive approach, integrating, as I say, the primary producer with the food business, with the consumer, to reflect how European food should become the global standard bearer for sustainability, and an opportunity to develop more circular economies and improve lifestyles in rural Europe. Including targets include a 25% stake for organic farming, which would be a massive ramping up from where we're at in Ireland in particular. But for agriculture, there's a lot of obvious issues in terms of the intensity of how it's practiced, the power of agricultural lobby groups as an interest group. There's no better oiled machine in Brussels, let me tell you. The fact that agriculture isn't part of the emissions limits set out in other parts of the economy, and the fact that the CAP is notoriously difficult to green, and MEPs have been guilty of watering that down in recent iterations in response to the Green Deal. Allied to this is biodiversity and ecosystems, measures to protect and restore fragile natural capital ecosystems and to recognise the essential goods they provide in terms of fresh water, clean and healthy air and soil, mitigation against natural disasters, and regulation of the climate. So the biodiversity came out in May this year, and that will enhance natural environments by taking some of the key drivers of environmental loss, such as unsustainable land use. There's an aim to make 30% of European lands protected, and seas, by the way, protected by 2030 in a bid to halt biodiversity and species loss and to restore carbon sinks to their natural state. But also to combat pollution, invasive species, degradation of ecosystems, and equally to more positively deploy nature-based solutions with a view to inspiring and accelerating transformational change. I'm representing an urban local authority. We're going to look closely at the proposals to help European cities to green themselves and to increase green spaces and biodiversity within a city context. And beyond that, there was also a new forest strategy published during the year, which includes a roadmap for planting at least 3 billion additional trees in the continent by, I think that's by 2030, as well as to work non-deforestation commitments into trade deals with partners overseas. The final objective, if you will, is called zero pollution, measures to cut pollution rapidly and to create a toxic-free environment. Key to this will be better monitoring, reporting, prevention, and if need, remedy to pollution within air, water, soil, and addressing some of the downstream effects that threaten the safety of our consumer products. So we've had a chemicals strategy produced, and we will have a zero pollution action plan in coming months, I believe. And this will help to preserve biodiversity in lakes, rivers, wetlands in particular, and reduce harmful pollution from microplastics and from the pharmaceutical industry. So all in all, it is an umbrella, and it's also got many tentacles and many arms, I think it's safe to say. Aside from the 8 sector topics, there are also the human dimension of nobody being left alone. Brussels is an easy scapegoat at the best of times. There's a recognition of the need for public buy-in, the need to cultivate trust, a middle ground between the carrot and the stick, if you will, to avoid the gilets jaunes syndrome that hit France in the last 2 years in relation to rises in energy costs and fuel at the pump. So carbon pricing will need to be sensitively and progressively done in order to avoid a backlash. And the whole notion of just transition, quote unquote, which is a very broad context, but it's the social corner of the sustainability triangle involving communities in decision-making with a view to somehow, I suppose, stress testing environmental measures and avoiding unwelcome, unintended knock-on costs. Basically, not allowing climate action to widen inequality. And there's a lot of evidence that socioeconomic status and conditions correlate with negative environmental and well-being factors, and there's a need to sort of nip that in the bud. So Europe will use the Green Deal to work towards a just transition of its own, and that, to be honest, that term is now absolutely everywhere, but it has particular meaning in EU terms. It's also important to engage with communities and organizations and citizens individually. The Commission is, as of tomorrow, bringing forward what's called the Climate Pact, which seeks to commit organizations to pledges towards environmental performance with a view to triggering momentum and action. There will be targeted supports, unexplained for the moment, on buildings, on mobility, and on urban greening, and look forward to hearing more of them tomorrow. But this is with a view to not only acting immediately, but also inspiring, showcasing, exchanging information, learning, collaborating, basically the snowball effect. From our point of view, I'm happy to say we've taken a stance within Cork City to sign up to something called the Mannheim Message, which is about putting ourselves in with the vanguard of greener European cities and trying to impress on the Commission the need for the local level to seize control of the European Green Deal if it's to have any practical effect. And I'm happy to say the Lord Mayor provided us with a quote unquote in that regard. And then there's the research angle, which is going to be huge because it's not just about planting trees and providing soil, but also the technological angle in areas like climate capture and storage. Europe doesn't want to be left behind in this. The point is that much of the technology needed is recognized as being here and being costed. For example, low carbon cement is possible, but it needs investment to make the new industries behind it competitive. So implementation of sustainable tech and practices across all industrial sectors is possible, and it's going to be prioritized with a phasing out of those that are not aligned to EGD objectives. It's thought that the energy sector alone could be decarbonized by 2040, which would be a major hole in the problem, if you will. But the great leap forward to 55% reduction by 2030, that requires an emphasis on making existing technologies in areas of energy or construction, mobility and food production, making them impactful, scaling them to the right effect, amplifying them, accelerating solutions, be that alternative energy or fuel cells or efficiency systems or inbuilt digitalization systems, bringing them to the fore, along with emerging agendas like the great silver bullet that is hydrogen, or circularity models, or alternative proteins in food. These need to be moved forward with investment. And then we have the great enablers of Industrial Revolution 4.0, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, they need to be also taken to the next learning with sustainability in mind. So there's quite a lot to go into there. But fundamentally, there's also a role for innovation in that social side of things I just alluded to. Their technological revolution can't leave people behind either. High tech can't be a goal in itself. It needs to use its own capacities to lower the access threshold for spreading knowledge and power and income as a democratization approach in the green agenda equally. So it's not going to be a problem Europe having enough jobs. It's really about having the necessary skills to fill the jobs for the future. COVID, I've almost got away without mentioning it. So far, it struck after the Green Deal had been produced, yet it changed everything. It changed everything utterly, and it's been a huge factor in the meantime in programming a recovery for Europe. I might come back to it if there is time later, but we'll press on for the moment. Investment is probably a key issue for you. The bad news is that the Green Deal is not a fund in itself, but there is going to have to be ways to finance the transition in a collective effort. And it's reckoned that an additional 82 to 147 billion will be required over the next decade. The EU isn't providing that in its entirety. It's going to leverage, if you will, through various means and mechanisms, but it's going to be up to national governments, the public purse, and to individual companies, the private sector and investors, really to mobilize, to trigger investment. That is the imperative if a green recovery is going to come into play. With that in mind, the big picture is a plan rather than a fund. It's called the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan. It's the investment pillar of the Green Deal, strangely not mentioned in those European Council conclusions last week, but it aims to contributing to financing a sustainable transition, supporting regions and communities most exposed, building confidence in environmentally responsible projects and in new jobs and in the benefits, providing what they term tailored financing to a wide range of projects, small ones at individual household renovation scale, large ones like installation of networks, for example, in electric vehicle charging stations, through dedicated programs and products. So it's about drumming up interest on the first hand, using the European budget, a 7-year budget, and also the new recovery measure that was brought in post-COVID, that's called Next Generation EU. A combined 1.8 billion recovery package, a lot of it to be front-loaded over the next 3 years, and which will mobilize at least $1 trillion in specifically green investment over the next 10 years. There are any number of figures and facts and different models for this, but that's where this is all going. A quarter of the EU budget will be dedicated towards green and climate action. 37% of the recovery measures, given how COVID has made us all think about the environmental, given us all more of an environmental appreciation, and has been put into very much the same line of thinking. 37% of that amount will go towards green climate type actions over the coming years. So all total, that'll be over 500,000 in direct support, and there will be a trigger effect to multiply that further. And beyond that, there are other aspects to this, including an enabling framework for investment, both private and public, to facilitate and promote sustainable investments, and providing support to public administrations in identifying, structuring, and executing sustainable projects, so project management. And these are just some slides you can take away with you, just looking at a breakdown of the Next Gen EU at 750 billion, and the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, north of 1 trillion or 1,000 million, and there's that 30% earmark for climate action. There are some programs in particular. that we could look at. I won't go into any detail, but the CAP, I would estimate that about 4 billion of that, of Ireland's share of that, will go towards greening measures, however they might be formed. All of this is being negotiated at the moment, so I'm speculating. Horizon Europe, the research program, perhaps 35 billion. Ireland would have to bid for projects in that regard, but 35 billion would be green. The LIFE program is dedicated towards environment and to climate action. There's a 5.5 billion fund for Ireland to delve into, and cohesion policy, the structural funds, about 350 million for Ireland through the ERDF regional operational programs will have a green and particularly a just transition approach, and then there are others. The investment plan for Europe, InvestEU, is probably the backbone of the investment, the ex-investment plan for Europe. It's the backbone of the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan. It addresses market failures and investment gaps in order to boost investment, innovation and job creation. And just as the so-called Juncker Plan financed, say, a wind farm in Mayo or a massive forestry rollout called Dassos or Irish Ferries, renovation of its stock, or more generic kind of investments such as primary healthcare. Those are the kind of things that this program will seek to provide the financing for in areas including sustainable infrastructure, but also R&D, digitization, SME support, and social innovation and skills. And at least 30% of mobilized investments in this regard will have a green tint to them. So that's northwards of 250 to 200 to 300 billion in total. So I'm conscious we're running, I've probably gone over my allotted time. I'm going to leave you with the slides as kind of an aid memoir, just to say that finance is getting greener. There's analysis here of what the Next Gen EU program means for Ireland, and it will take the form of recovery and resilience programs on a national basis that will program loans and grants. So the government will come forward with programs over the next few months, and Ireland should get 1.27 billion from this to be spent over the next number of years. I can come back to this if there's time, but these slides would tend to detail the thinking from Europe about where Ireland and other countries need to spend its, need to identify its priorities and spend its money, including on what are called flagship areas. So this is all quite programmed into the European semester process, which is not something I'm going to get into explaining, but details how Europe would like to see member states govern their economies and societies in particular. And then this Just Transition Fund, or the mechanism more correctly, which is being programmed into our structural funds allocations. And I think you're probably familiar with this from the Midlands in particular, which is where it's focused on for the moment, and of very little import to Cork, about how it's taking a geographical take on that societal angle I spoke about in trying to wean particular regions off carbon intensive reliance. So the Midlands in the first instance, the wider Midlands, I might say, stretching into neighbouring counties for the moment. And the government has published its own Just Transition Fund in programme for 2020 in recent weeks, although they make no reference to the Green Deal. So there's a certain lack of coherence in evidence already. And we need to ask ourselves, how green is our deal? Frankly, it's not perfect, but it is worth doing. It is a win-win arrangement. COVID has only added to the mix. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I think generally only climate skeptics would argue against it. Its target and its end goals are real, but its detail is not, as you can tell from some of the hemming and hawing from my point of view. But it needs delivery detail, it needs leadership, it needs buy-in, it needs governance arrangements to secure its proper performance and monitoring, and above all, it needs investment with some meat on the bones. There are inconsistencies, such as with trade policy. There's a real danger of backsliding, a real danger of lobbying, watering down and diluting some of the terms that have been attached to it. But I would be cautiously optimistic that this can pass. And if we think of it just in terms of those green bottles hanging on the wall, it is fragile. If one of them were to fall, we'd be in a certain amount of trouble, but we have to hope that it's fundamentally not a bottle of smoke. So with that, I leave you. I would take questions or comments and try to answer them as best I can, perhaps by reference to Ireland in particular, I think is most germane, but Ronan, I'll bring it over to you now at this point.
Thanks very much, Ronan. A bit of a whirlwind tour there. I hadn't realised that the City Council were involved in so many different and diverse projects. In spite of the fact that I work for a local authority myself, I think myself and others tend to think of local authorities in terms of infrastructure, roads, water, that sort of thing. But obviously, the remit is much wider than that. So thank you very much for a very informative talk. Just to say before we get into Q&A, we will Ronan has kindly offered to make the slides available, and we will distribute them to the attendees in the next day or so. So just going to the Q&A. So Kieran O'Leary is asked there, overall the EU has exceeded their 2020 targets, but Ireland won't. How can we make our government step up? Is there citizens?
I wouldn't dare speak for the government, but I mean, the programme for government is, in writing, it's ambitious. It commits us to, I think, 7% reduction year on year from here to 2030. And in line with the EGD, you know, hitting net zero by 2050, as well as all that goes with in terms of biodiversity and natural heritage. But yeah, questioner's right. I mean, the CSO says we're below average on performance in key areas. The emissions are mathematically calculated. We've missed targets for 2020 in biodiversity. Unless there's really radical action, we're going to miss the 2030 ones as well. The Climate Change Advisory Council has warned that we're badly off course and drifting further and further. I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of opportunities as well. We could look at some of the main challenges, short term and long term. I think the audience probably recognizes what they are, and there's a danger I might answer other questions in that regard. But you know, short term, you think of water supply contamination of surface water, how that, you know, our taps having to be switched off and boiled, raw sewage discharge still going into the sea in 30-something points is kind of barbaric. Smoky fuels in built-up areas are still an issue. And all of this is an immediate, in a COVID era, this is an immediate health concern, but a health dividend if it could be addressed quickly. Over the last 10 years, we've had very serious declines in air and water quality, but also biodiversity. And then the medium term, we have urbanization pressures, we have infrastructure that's underdeveloped, both in terms of transport and in terms of the environmental side. We have production and consumption practices that are unsustainable. Our resource efficiency is very poor. Our circular economy is very poor indeed at a European level. It's something I see quite a lot of. And then in the longer term, the big picture, the decarbonisation, we're just not pulling our weight as a country. We're climate laggards. We'd rather spend our way out of things, it would seem, you know, by paying for compliance, and it's just kicking the can down the road. And then there's agriculture, which I've mentioned, which it's such a core part of the national economy and the national identity, but it is going beyond ecological barriers. It's 1/3 of national greenhouse gas emissions. Stock levels are very high. Pesticides and herbicides are running off into water. It contributes most of the ammonia into the atmosphere. Yeah, there's an awful lot of challenges there. But that's the, I suppose, the pessimistic side of the coin, to be honest. But I would say fundamentally, to answer the question, in the long run, we need to see the target not as a means, but as an end. And the end should be a more resilient, a more stable climate and economy and society as a result of that. If you can try and square that triangle, if that's not a geometrical impossibility. We need to get to a stage where we're sort of self-made in terms of carbon neutrality, and the Green Deal, such as we can put a structure on it, it's reasonably well aligned, I think, to address some of those challenges. There's something in that, in all 8 of those areas, and in some of those cross-cutting areas, such as technology and just transition, and for Ireland to take more out of. And I think it'll concentrate a lot of minds in that it'll make an insistence on better monitoring and reporting and prevention, and bringing about better remediation and improvements to situations that mightn't always have been the case. And you can already see within the climate bill recently published, there's some of the fingerprints of the Green Deal thinking seem to be in evidence there. And, I suppose having a green-minded minister who's suddenly put environment at the front of the door plate of his department, and move communications further down the phrase, comes into play here to a certain extent, but I'm not going to play politics with that either. So that's a very long answer to that question.
No, that's fair enough. It was quite an open question. I suppose a somewhat more specific question. Sam Bowles is asking, are there specific supports for cycling and micro-mobility? I know that the City Council obviously have been doing a lot of work in that area, or a lot of, I suppose they've always been doing it, but a lot of visible work in terms of cycle lanes and that in recent times.
There's very little that is specific at all for the moment, Sam. It's very much the headlines. We know there's going to be, for example, support for whatever, I mentioned it actually in the presentation, for direct support for renovation, or for electric vehicle charge out networks. There will be money for cycling now, but I couldn't hit upon quite what form it's going to take, and indeed what of it is going to be grant-based and what of it is going to be loan-based. I would look towards the Resilience and Recovery Fund programme for Ireland, which the government is concocting, has to submit by the end of April, should be consulting on with stakeholders. I don't know if that's happening or not. I would look to that as sort of to give the lead out on where this will go, and then other funds will come into play. Some of them will be bigger than others. European funding in itself is usually quite small scale, the hundreds and thousands, the millions between a few transnational partners, rather than the infrastructural side of things. But there will be infrastructure under the operational programs supported by ERDF for the southern region and the other 2 regions, or possibly a national approach to that, which will have regional components. And you'll have seen under the current program for 2014 to 2020, a number of towns and cities, those that were linked into the National Spatial Strategy at the time, they put in place investments in sustainable soft mobility actions. Our Mary Elms Bridge is partly that, in that it links different aspects of the cycling network, which is coming on leaps and bounds in the COVID era in regard, but others have done it in a more obvious headline bespoke way.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. We have, I think, maybe perhaps more comments than a question from Kieran O'Leary. The EU 2028-52 regs has already had an impact, but banks/investors are still trying to figure it out. And he said that's Annex 1 and 2.
I don't know what 852. I'm presuming it's a regulation. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's kind of sustainability.
As much as I know, I'm not a font of all knowledge on that. I would just say on banks and investment, green financing is going to be very important, that enabling kind of framework that's built into it. So a lot of the investment, 30% of the investment under the Next Generation Recovery Plan is going to be through green bonds, for example, encouraging investors to prioritize, I suppose, sustainability and giving that a bit of a boost. But there are other measures that are being used to try and encourage people to see investment through a green lens, if you will. And that's a real opportunity for, I think generally speaking, if you get the money side of things right, a lot will follow, and there's no shortage of investors out there at this moment, with interest rates being quite historically low. But there's a need to avoid public investment decisions doing the usual thing, or getting locked into carbon intensive or other unsustainable behaviors and technology. So I referenced the climate bill earlier. That is a new carbon budgeting framework into it. And as green budgeting tools are also part of the thinking behind some of the work the EIB are doing, in particular, to try and prioritize the attractiveness, I suppose, the promotion and the attractiveness of sustainable investment. And looking beyond just your standard cost benefit analysis to try and look at the wider sustainability ramifications of projects. And on top of that, weeding out environmentally unsustainable subsidies is going to be an important aspect. There's no sense in really robbing Peter to pay Paul. That makes no sense whatsoever.
Fair enough. I suppose, I know somewhat of a lead on from that, but I suppose you had been speaking earlier about, I suppose, say in connection with carbon taxes, and that they need to be progressively applied so that they don't, kind of put people into kind of things like fuel poverty and that. But I suppose on the flip side of that, and talking about investment and that side of things, is there still a need for your kind of, shall we call them early adopters, your kind of middle class person who, kind of wants to do the right thing and will kind of push the envelope out and will buy the somewhat expensive electric car that, that another person might be able to afford now, but that by bringing things like that into the mainstream, by, when they've go to their bank and say, I want to invest a bit of money, I'd like to invest it in something with kind of green credentials. Is there a PR aspect to bring about all of the, the kind of sustainability agenda?
Yeah, I think it probably all ties in with some of what I was saying about the greening of a green revolution, really, in financing. Somebody's got to do it in terms of the early adopter. At a high level, the EIB is now rebadged itself as Europe's green bank, not just Europe's bank. It's aligned itself to the Paris Agreement. It's restricting investment in fossil fuels as of next year. So that's a certain amount of consistency, and it's ramping up its environmentally conscious lending as well. I can't quite think what it is. Perhaps 50% of its lending or something like that will go in that regard, and that'll go right across the panoply of areas, and they'll also have a loan facility. But that, say, for example, that green bond issue, that comes with needs development of standards to go with that. That's going to play an important role in financing assets being needed, financing the assets, and providing public sector with guidance and the appropriate tools in areas like green. If you're talking about leverage, green public procurement is going to be a huge area there, and that's something where the Commission has a lot of experience and will expertise in trying to sell the idea and bring new techniques into play. And I think that more than the individual will probably be the leverage if you want to be early adopter to get things going, allied with work on state aid, which is an area of great technicality I'm not going to get into, but needs to be supportive. I should just say there's also a renewed sustainable finance strategy as of recent months. I haven't looked into it, but that is with a view to making it easier for investors to identify the investments that are sustainable and ensuring that they're credible. And it goes with the other supports, the enabling measures. There's others, like there's a thing called a taxonomy, which is a classification system agreed at international level with China in the first instance, just to really badge what is green and what is not, and how green is your investment. So all of this is in the background and helps to influence the investment determination, I think.
Apology, I was on mute. Apologies. Sorry, I was just saying that the issue of greenwashing, where companies stick a label and say something is green, a product or a service or whatever, is going to be a problem going forward, isn't it? And that's why you need those standards in place to ensure that your consumer is actually getting what they're paying for.
Yeah, for example, we have a thing called eco-labeling at European level, but it's not compulsory. So unless you're particularly, proud of your green credentials and they stack up, you're not going to put it on it. It's not a sliding scale. It's not like the energy efficiency on fridges, or the A to F in that regard. So those are areas that need a lot of attention. I'm not quite sure whether the Commission is seeking to ramp that up in years to come, but it's an important area, and consumer information is something that is going to have a great bearing on the future and the success of this as an endeavour.
Perfect. I'll just take maybe one or two quick questions. This one's from David Memory, actually a former committee member with us, and maybe quite a specific question, but I think interesting at the same time. President, the Port of Rotterdam is actively engaged in providing facilities for alternative low carbon fuels such as hydrogen. In light of Cork's position with a large harbour capacity, do you believe there is scope for the Cork region to become a hub, leveraging the EGD to become a port of choice for environmentally sustainable maritime transport?
I wouldn't speak for the Port of Cork, but I think this is the kind of thing that might seek financing under the Connecting Europe facility, which is a different kettle of fish to what I would deal with in European funding terms. Deals more in terms of infrastructural facilities. It's the fund that's being tapped into for the interconnector with France, which will provide enough green energy to supplant Money Point in a couple of years' time. So the thinking goes. Look, I think specialization is always seen as quite a good thing in European policy terms and probably in economic terms. And if the Southwest was to devise a certain forte in the renewable energy sphere, it has to be kept in a depot somewhere, and the Port of Cork may have the facilities in the future that it does not have in its current location. I leave that to the County Council, if you don't mind, to answer down the line.
Very good. I'll get on to Liam Drummy about that. I think a couple of the other questions are somewhat repeating, so I'll just take this one. The UK have a regreening fund which gives grants for development, which is going to improve the biodiversity of land that is waste. Is there any intention in Ireland in this regard?
I couldn't speak for Ireland. I'd say the UK have a lot of things all of a sudden that they didn't have a couple of years ago because they didn't need them, but a lot of them would be quite parallel to what is in place or coming down the track in European terms. It's European funding is different in that a lot of it is about softer actions, exchange of information, knowledge sharing, best practice, that kind of thing. It wouldn't tend to go in for the solid standalone infrastructural investment. As I say, that happens sometimes under the structural funds. Those are getting smaller and smaller in an Irish context. But I think although I didn't have time to go into it, the slides will show the menu of some of the options that are coming, and it's safe to say that biodiversity being one of the 8 pillars, can you have 8 pillars? Thematically of the Green Deal is something that will get a huge amount of attention, and unfunded this year in particular. I can't see that going backward. COVID really was an unintentional, if we're ever to take a silver lining, it really was a shot in the arm for this kind of agenda, and it bulked up the financial backing for it by a further 80%, which is massive, and obviously biodiversity would be a factor in that.
Very good. I suppose it's just the specific question. It's not a funding thing, but you know the county council at the moment are rolling out a scheme where their own lands that are, you know, after perhaps a road scheme or something where you've a small parcel of land that is being unused, that they're kind of rolling out a biodiversity program to, you know, plant trees and stuff like that. So it's something moving in the right direction anyway.
It all starts with small steps. We've, you know, parklets in the city or roundabouts or something like that.
Yeah.
Every little helps, and greening of cities is going to be something we're certainly going to look to Europe for in the next few years as we try to impress our green credentials on our peers on the continent.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it's both about biodiversity, but also about placemaking. I mean, making cities a nice place to live, and I say that as somebody who lives in the middle of Cork City. You know, it is nice to have kind of green areas, you know, where be they kind of larger parks where you can go to visit, or, you know, even if you're just on a journey from point A to point B, that there's you know, there's kind of green areas or trees around. You know, it just makes the environment, the built environment more pleasant to live in. So look, I might wrap up there, Ronan. We've one or two other questions, but I think they're kind of mostly been answered as part of other questions. So once again, I'd like to thank you very much for an excellent lecture, very informative. I think the engagement and the Q&A and the number of participants, you know, shows a great engagement with the topic. You know, so we're very grateful for you for volunteering to come and speak to us tonight.